Hey everyone, thanks again for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the performance. I'd like to introduce Netta and our guest today, but before I do, I just want to let you know that I'm going to be sort of fielding questions and comments from all of you. So I'll pipe in towards the end of the discussion to get a few of those in. So today our guest is Jack Halberstam, professor at Columbia University, author of The Queer Art of Failure and an upcoming book called Wild Things, among many others. So we're honored to have you, Jack, and I'll let Netta take it on.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everybody. It's amazing to be here. Thank you for being with us. I'm super happy to be here with Jack and Mark. And I could talk to Jack for hours and hours and hours, but I just wanted to get our conversation started by saying that Jack's new book has a chapter about Nijinsky, so that's one of the many reasons that I asked Jack to join us. So Jack, if you have any thoughts to start us off with, that would be awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Netta and Marc and everyone who's watching. What a treat for us all to be able to see Paramodernities. Again, I watched it in person in the theater, and it was a marathon, and it was extraordinary. But really, each episode does deserve this kind of attention. So I'm actually very happy that we have the opportunity to sit with it as a series of chapters in a much bigger project. When it was performed live, I was a guest speaker in the Mark Cunningham section, which was really great. But my real interest was always in Nijinsky, so I was super happy when Netta asked me to get involved in this talk back. Why am I interested in Nijinsky? I'm not a dance scholar, really, but there's something about this ballet, which, as you saw both in the performance that you just witnessed and in the text that you were listening to, the ballet is really a kind of destruction, if you like, an active, counter to ballet as it had emerged in the 19th century. And there's part of me felt like there was a really queer element to the Rite of Spring. And so I wanted to investigate the potential queerness of this piece, but then also what made it both so alluring and powerful, but also so enraging to the audiences who saw it. So even if you don't know much about Nijinsky and Rite of Spring, you probably know that when it was performed, one of very few times that it was actually performed, in 1913 in Paris, the audience erupted and people whistled and screamed at the stage. And several times Stravinsky and Diaghilev had to come out and tell the crowd to quiet down so that the ballet could continue on. So this is sort of an extraordinary event that happened. So there are a couple of things that I was interested in this ballet, some of which really dovetail nicely with the performance that you just saw. One is the contradiction in the ballet between the fact that it's Rite of Spring, it's a fertility ritual, but it's performed in a way that keeps the male dancers almost completely separate from the female dancers. So that even if it's supposed to be a fertility ritual, A, the central event is that somebody dies rather than someone being born, and B, there's almost no contact between the male dancers and the female dancers. And in the version you just saw, the whole ballet is actually winnowed down in this amazing way to a series of gestures performed not by a female chosen one, but by a male surrogate. And that's a big part of what happens at the beginning of the piece. So I want us to think about that, what it means that the chosen one here, the person who is being sacrificed to dance, to politics, to fertility, is in fact the body of a male dancer here rather than a female dancer. Second, behind the scenes, Stravinsky, Diaghilev, and Nijinsky were all at various times lovers. Right, and this is not necessarily, a super articulated part of the history of Rite of Spring, especially for Stravinsky, who's largely understood to be heterosexual. But this was a time of much more amorphous understandings of sexual identity. And even though later on Nijinsky was married, he was at this time Diaghilev's lover. And Diaghilev was a super interesting sort of Oscar Wilde figure who was openly homosexual at a time when that was not at all, supposedly what you should make explicit. So there's so much behind this ballet that is queer that it feels right to do a queer reading of it. But then another aspect is that this ballet was never really properly written down. And so the versions that we get of the ballet are an approximation or an estimation or a fantasy of what actually happened. And that's very interesting just in terms of how canonical the ballet is, yet we don't really know what the ballet was. So there's a kind of what I call an aesthetic of bewilderment in the ballet, where we project our fantasy from the little bits of notes and witness accounts that are left. Finally, and this is an interesting part of the history of the ballet, some scholars have suggested that the outrage of the Parisian audience was on account of the kind of folk content within the ballet. And famously, Stravinsky had toured around Russia, and he had listened to all kinds of folk music in Russia, and he had uploaded some of that music into his understanding of the symphony that he wrote. And of course, the story of this ballet is of a supposedly traditional tribal culture performing a dance, making a sacrifice to the gods in the hope of a good harvest. So there's a kind of both channeling of indigenous aesthetics, but also a kind of repudiation of indigeneity because it's cast as something in the past that modernity moves on from. So some scholars have suggested that the Parisian audience was upset because they were looking at this incredible performance of what was still visible as an indigenous aesthetic. And I find that to be also a really interesting reading. So there are so many, there are so many parts to this, the queer, the indigenous, the surrogation. And then, the piece that we begin with in Paramodernities, which is something that I want to ask Netta and Marc about, which is the question of sacrifice. And a large part of the text that you just listened to at the beginning of this piece from Paramodernities is about the sacrifice that the dancer makes to the dance. And so I was interested, both in thinking about what sacrifice means in modern cultures, particularly as we're living in this moment of COVID-19, where all kinds of disastrous plans have been floated that presume that part of the population, for example, can be sacrificed for the health of the other part, but also where large numbers of people are sheltering in place while small groups of often disadvantaged people are still working on the front lines of this disease. So sacrifice is a super current issue. And so I wanted to ask you, Netta, to maybe talk about sacrifice at this moment and what it meant to you to replace the female dancer with a male dancer.
I mean, I think about, I think, we've talked about this, you and I in the past, about sort of in the Nijinsky or just in dancing, that there's, for me, there's this constant balancing or constant give and take between sacrifice and like empowerment that I get from that act. And I think that's maybe not necessarily, that's not so relevant to what we're experiencing here in terms of what's happening in the world. But I mean, I think also thinking about sacrifice as something that somebody is telling you to do or asking you to do or prescribing that you do, or that the female dancer gets sacrificed not because she wants to, but because that's part of the society that she lives in, that's part of the ritual, that's part of what the value system that they denote. So that's what happens to her. And again, I think the dynamic in the dance for myself when I used to dance it, and I think, I don't know, Marc will talk for himself about like, you have to follow the prescription of the choreography or the task. I think of this dance as a series of essentially tasks. Like every move and every gesture is a task, and they're strung in this order, and you have to go through with it. And then at the end of it, you sort of find out where you are. are. But there's this relationship between agency and between submission that I think that I can speak to. I don't know if you want to go on from there, Marc, or
Yeah, I feel like listening to you talk, Jack, it's making me think of the original dancers that did this piece. And I know for myself as a dancer, in many ways, I move blindly through my career because I go to where I'm asked to move. So I don't know how much those dancers had, a perspective or a say in what moves were generated. And I think there's like a sacrifice inherent in that, this need to want to move, want to be seen, want to be part of something great. So it's like, so I feel like there's a sacrifice inherent in that, and they're just like, yeah, sure, like I'll do it. And then on top of that, especially doing this solo, it made me realize like how raw the dancer is as sort of like an example of what society is, or what it's done to us, like what it's done to our bodies, and like kind of like what's the word, like primitive in a way. Like all these ideas that we're trying to talk about are being enacted through the body, which is a lot to take on, I think, as a dancer. But there's something that you think it'll bring the conversation just that much further. So you want to do whatever to your body in order to say something or do something magnificent, or I don't know what words really else describe that.
Well, you know, one of the ways in which the dance was described at the time, there's this incredible essay by a French critic, Jacques Halberstam, who talks about the broken stances, you know, whether it's the way the hands hang, or the way that the feet pigeon toe. There's a kind of breaking of the form, whereas classical ballet is about hiding the labor of the dancer on the one hand, right? So that however exhausting the dance is, it's supposed to look effortless, and it's supposed to look clean, and the grace is embodied in the line. And in Rite of Spring, one of the reasons, again, that it met with such dismay in the audience is because the gestures and the shape of the body in the dance is broken. And of course, the more that the chosen one particularly dances, this is a dance in which they die at the end of the dance. So the whole idea of sacrifice is foregrounded in this dance, whereas traditionally the dance hides the effort. And you know, we were talking earlier about the Pina Bausch version, which is, you know, rightfully famous precisely because it foregrounds that labor, whether it's in the way that the dancers sweat, or you hear them slapping the bodies, or you hear them panting, right? So it's interesting, right, to be engaged in a dance where the dance is explicit about the fact that in dancing this, you will break, you know, and I feel like that breaking is what we're drawn to. It's the seduction of the piece. And I thought that was sort of captured in a way in the dialogue between the dance and the speaker, but also the sort of triangle on the stage is how I would describe it, which is between Marc, who's performing, and Netta, who's sitting in various poses on the stage. And then there's a sort of unlit area in the back of the stage that is just dark. So I'm interested in this this relationship that is probably available in the original piece, but that is so much a part of this performance of it. And I wondered, whether you guys wanted to talk about this, which in the text is written about as the relationship between topos, meaning place, chora, meaning bodies in space, and then kenon, meaning void. And I thought that the void had a big role to play in this piece. And I wondered how deliberate was it in the way in which you placed yourselves in relation to each other on the stage? Are we supposed to notice that as an audience, or are we supposed to engage with that?
Yeah, I mean, The void was, I guess, more passively engaged with, but it's really interesting that you bring it up. I think it's engaged because I'm a choreographer and I compose things, and in my intuition about how things are composed, there's a consideration of what's there and what's not there, and how space what space sets up in terms of tension and focus. I think in the beginning of the essay or the beginning of the performance, the way we ended up formulating it once I was sort of unable to dance this dance anymore is sort of these questions like, who's doing this thing? Who's authoring the thing? What is the thing? Who owns it? Who has it? Who's writing it? Who's reading it? Like all these questions. And there's some, I guess in my mind right now, I'm just thinking about the void in relationship to these questions, and sort of like there's some kind of like interaction with absence throughout it. But like more concretely, I wasn't going to dance this dance anymore because in some ways, sort of like my knee at the time was unable to take on. So after years of dancing, sort of I couldn't do this. And the idea of just removing myself kind of like felt like just letting some kind of like too much slack somehow. So I was there also because originally me dancing it, again, was sort of upheld this heteronormative kind of structure. The woman is dancing herself to, exhaustion and kind of effectively, melodramatically there, and the man is sitting cool, calm, and collected and reciting theory. And at the time, it wasn't a recording. The text was spoken live entirely, so there was a lot of power felt in the hands of the person who was bringing the text to the audience, David. So so then once Marc was brought into the role, I felt like it was important to just keep complicating everything by making me there passive, watching a sort of a written thing, something that I knew in my body so well. It was inscribed. Like when I watch Marc dance, I feel everything that he's doing, or I see everything that he does differently from how I had done it. And to complicate the space. And then when I leave, because I have to go get ready to perform the gram, which happens afterwards, there's this void of the shadow of the maybe more original body for our version. The author, am I the author of this thing? Obviously the female body gets removed. So yeah, it's fun. It's fun in dance, and maybe this is connected to what you're talking about in terms of how the Rite of Spring was received, is like it's a fantasy. It's like we get to create in a way these fantasies, like that they're slippery, and I love that about dance. Nobody can just say it's just this, it's the many things. And I think that's also my desire in making paramodernity, is sort of putting theory next to dance, because there's something slippery about theory as well. I don't know if you would agree with that, but
well, I think the way you bring the discursive into relationship with the choreographed, it creates exactly that slipperiness, which is partly what's so great about it. The other thing I was thinking is that in a lot of ballet pieces, particularly canonical ballet, it'd be very difficult to just slot a male dancer into the female role, it seems like, because the training must be really different. But it didn't seem that difficult here, which is another piece of evidence for the way in which Nijinsky's choreography was not about creating these, maidens, these swans that are leaping and lifted and light and fragile, being carried by strong frames. In fact, when you watch this particular version of the Dance of the Chosen One, you realize the physicality that Nijinsky was willing to write for the female dancer. I mean, that must have been kind of an extraordinary thing too. But of course, there is another person sitting on the stage in this kind of quiet, passive mode, and that's David, the person who's supposedly reading the script, but in fact only reads what are supposedly interjections. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot, what I'm trying to pay attention to as a void is in several places, in several of the pieces in Paramodernity. And I really like that, because it reminds you that as an audience, that a step is created by stillness, just as a conversation is created by silence, and we're asked to pay attention to all of these different spatial dynamics on the stage at once. But it also reminded me of a moment in the text where you talked about this extraordinary final performance that Nijinsky does, where he's asked to do a performance. I think it was in the wake of World War I, and he does a performance called How We Live, where he sits on the stage without moving, which is, which could just be seen as a refusal, but is itself a performance. And you do have somebody on the stage who's sitting there without moving. So there's seems to me that you're implying that there's always this figure on the stage who's not moving, and that's what allows the dynamic of the piece to flow. So that I don't know if you wanted.
I mean, that's interesting. It's interesting. Yes, and in fact, there was a refusal, like in taking a scholar's body and integrating it into a dance, a highly physical, highly technical space of intelligent, articulate bodies. It was really interesting to contend with this not other kind of body, but in some way, yes. And particularly with David, there was a refusal in some way of coercing his body into certain kinds of behaviors that would be appropriate on stage. So we had to sort of like deal with what his body, or what his relationship with himself, like how he can tell himself to do things, how he can kind of like accept my sovereignty or the sovereignty of the space, like what it denotes a performance space, and deal with that. And that was part of the kind of interesting material of the piece, the power struggle. This refusal of that body to just sit, or even if you can just think about like Nijinsky's ability to just sit was different from a scholar, or David's ability to just sit. Like Nijinsky's ability arguably is a skilled ability, is a sort of intentional ability to not move. And it's, I think, very different from somebody who's maybe not skilled that way. So I'm trying to think always about always in this piece, about the layers of intelligence and knowledge that dancers have and that dancing brings about, that are invisible, and that we don't share necessarily like we share language. So just thinking about that, different kinds of refusal. Wow.
Yeah, and also the refusal of this distinction between a theory of dance and then dance. We're being asked to see the theory through the choreography, and then think about theory and the performance of theory as a performance. So seeing David either sit or move, interrupt, and then in some of the other chapters, you have the scholar, the scholar really move or be moved around by the dancers. So I think that's the slipperiness that you pay attention to in a way that is super effective.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me. I know we have to probably end soon. Yeah.
I'll just read down a couple of thoughts that people have written, if that's fine with you guys. Megan Williams says, seeing it as a film adds more to the questions of space. I said to myself, why did Netta leave? It was so potent on my screen. Then I remembered why, smiley face. Claudia Porcasitas said how important it is to understand the historical context when we see dance. I love the way this work helps the audience to enter this world through the projections and text. And David, in reference to something you said, Jack, sovereign power is telling today the bodies of the entire world populace what to do, move, and especially not move. This is really unprecedented. So I'll leave you guys with that. If you guys want to, we have like a minute or two where we have to wrap up. But
well, I think David's comment is, takes us back to where we began, that we're the very dynamics between sovereign powers and people, or disciplinary dynamics and discourse, are the questions engaged by this piece. What is the relationship between the dancing core and the choreographer, between the author and the dancer, between the dancer and the role. Those questions are being played out in really deliberate ways right now, and in sometimes in unpredictable and chaotic ways in relationship to this invisible threat that we're all, in relationship to. And I think, the whole point of paramodernities is to question the discursive structures that we enter into and think about how to alter them. And there's never been a better time to be doing that work.
Thank you.
Netta, anything else before I steal the show?
Oh, go for it. I'm just thinking.
Yeah, that was, I just want to say, like, off script, that this is, I'm really glad you got to be involved with this, and I'm excited for the rest of the week. This feels like, I don't know, a really useful moment to talk about things maybe unrelated to what we're all going through, but in some way it's making me think more presently about this moment, and my body a little bit more, because I've sort of been forgetting about it. But also, if you guys want to get more of a really good conversation between Netta and Jack, there's a really amazing Bomb interview, Bomb magazine, that you could find online. And also, if you want to buy a copy, it's a really beautiful spread. And so thanks for everyone that watched today. Oh, there it is. Thanks to everyone that watched today. We're going to screen again tomorrow, same time, Paramodernities #2, Trauma, Interdiction, and Agency in the House of Pelvic Truth, a response to Martha Graham's 1947 Night Journey, followed by a discussion between Netta and choreographer Pam Tanowitz. So stay safe out there and have a good day. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Netta. And goodbye.
Thank you, Jack.